Um, so despite my research being about digger identity construction, today I'd like to talk to you about the place of texts and the place of writing within the concept of what I call a digger strategy. A brief introduction and contextualization. The 17th century English diggers are mostly remembered for the enthusiastic defense of common ownership of the land during the turbulent first years of the English Commonwealth. It is thanks to their publication of a series of pamphlets and broadsides where they advocated for the resurrection of God's spirits in mankind, declaring all men equal, opposing institutionalized religion, monarchy, and day labor, for example, that we are able to understand them in the wider context of Civil War radicalism, instead of another mere early modern English episode of enclosure protest. Notably, it was well known today amongst early modern scholars how central print had become for the construction of politics and religious dispute in such context. The period's instability led to the more feeble censorship, allowing for print culture to develop greatly. Newsbooks, pamphlets, broadside ballads, a whole market for information and the dissemination of news and ideas emerged in 17th century England in ways that hadn't previously been experienced on the island. Print was thus becoming a crucial tool in the conduction of politics and disputes of the period. Therefore, literary studies, such as John Braidman's work on pamphlets, for example, are indispensable to fully understand such context. Many of the debates that were being held were disseminated through print, with the people from the perspectives on whether the king should be executed or not, and exactly how legal it was for Parliament to do so, to which paths England should follow after the downfall of monarchy, in order to gain support for a cause or engage in a certain debate through print. Thus, a specific post-Reformation kind of public sphere was in the making in the 17th century England, influenced by the larger access to literacy promoted by the Protestant defense of translations of the biblical text and other components. Moreover, print also became crucial in the development of radical politics, or rather creativity, as has recently been argued by Michael Braddock, by allowing a larger variety of groups and individuals to express their views on politics, religion, morals, and on the events taking place in England at the time. However, writing was not the solely way in which the diggers spread their word. They conceived a very particular way of disseminating their views on what should be done in England in order for it to be the first land wherein truth shall sit down in triumph. In their pamphlets, we perceive that for them, the ideas of writing and acting meant two different things. When defending the need to take action in order to enlighten the hearts of men, they meant mainly two things. One, going through the countryside, spreading their views through the spoken word, and the second, organizing occupations on wastelands and enclosures that were once common land. Thus, writing, speaking, and occupying formed the basis on which digger strategy took place. What we propose today is a look into the place occupied by texts within such strategical scope on the part of the diggers, focusing especially on Gerrard Winstanley, the most prolific of digger writers and the responsible for the creation of such divisions between writing and acting within the digger strategy. So the experience of writing for Winstanley. Originally from Wigan, Lancashire, in the 1640s, Gerrard Winstanley was one of the many London merchants who was experiencing harsh perils and economic difficulties directly and indirectly inflicted by the civil wars. As a cloth merchant, the disruption of the Irish market as well as the heavy war taxations are amongst the many factors that led him into bankruptcy. It was in 1648, after he had to relocate to Cobham with his wife Susan to be able to benefit from her family's aid, that Winstanley seemed to be drawn to writing. This period of his life is involved in a certain degree of mystery and uncertainty, but from his writings, as well as what we know of his continuous failed economic endeavors, leads historians to characterize such period as one of a spiritual crisis or a spiritual awakening, or even some cases of depression. The fact is that in some point during this personal crisis, Winstanley allegedly fell into a trance, a common 17th century trope mobilized to characterize moments of clarity, epiphanies, or inspirations. And in this trance, he was led to write, inspired by the spirit of reason, that is, God in his perception. In 1649, he wrote about what he experienced in 1648, and I quote Winstanley: "Being quiet at my work, my heart was filled with sweet thoughts, and many things were revealed to me, which I never read in books, nor heard from the mouth of any flesh. And when I began to speak of them, some people could not bear my words. And amongst those revelations, this was one, that the earth shall be made a common treasury of livelihood to the whole mankind, without respect of persons. And I had a voice within me, bade me declare it all abroad, which I did obey." Between 1648 and 1649, Winstanley produced 5 tracts that delved in matters of theology, social inequalities, biblical interpretations, the situation in England, and more. All his tracts were to be sold by the now notorious radical printer Giles Calvert. Winstanley used these first pamphlets to define and disclose his interpretations of matters such as God, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, election and universal salvation, the fall, the nature of angels, devils, and hell, and so on and so forth. Eventually, the matter of unholiness of holding land private starts to appear, gaining a gradually more central position, probably influenced by his new countryside reality. Each one of these pamphlets re-engages with the issues left uncertain in its predecessor, as said by John Gurney, strengthening its arguments, refining definitions and key concepts until, in The New Law of Righteousness, the last of his pre-digging pamphlets, embodies Winstanley's theories and perceptions on matters of social and religious nature. The fact that Winstanley claimed to be writing motivated by the Spirit's whispers partly justifies some characteristics of his texts. Apart from the Bible and Fox's Book of Martyrs, for example, he does not reference any other type of written work, even though influences of contemporary authors, books, and pamphlets can be somewhat perceived in his writings. As noted by Ariel Hessayon, Winstanley was not one known for giving credit where credit was due in his writings. But again, how could he credit earthly influences if he was writing as a vessel to the Spirit? This is likely to be the same reason as to why, when he later republished a compilation of these 5 previous tracts in December 1649, under the title of Several Pieces Gathered in One Volume, no amendments, alterations, or corrections to the content of the texts was made whatsoever, apart from the inclusion of a preface. Again, how could he author these if they were dictated by the Spirit himself? In the preface to several pieces, Winstanley spoke about his experience with writing. The way he describes his writing process on those 5 first tracts resonates with a sense of urgency, of healing through productivity, through pouring out on paper the various conflicts dueling within an afflicted soul, or yet driven primarily by an inner light, as argued by John Gurney. So these are the 5 first tracts published by Winstanley. The first one, The Mystery of God Concerning the Whole Creation Mankind, on the left, The Breaking of the Day of God on the right, both from 1648. The Saint's Paradise, also from 1648, and Truth Lifting Up Its Head Above Scandals, which is printed in 1649, but does have a preface that dates to 1648. Therefore, by the opening months of 1649, Winstanley's theory seemed to be in place, and then he proceeded to add the idea of action, practical action, for, and I quote him, "Action is the life of all." John Gurney characterized this pamphlet the New Law of Righteousness, the last of his tracts before his involvement with the St. George's Hill Diggers, as written within a framework of practical Christianity, like its predecessors, but in this case expressed in a way that shifted the agency from the charitable to the poor themselves. It was in the New Law of Righteousness where Winstanley explicitly connected the fall with private ownership of land, attacking the prevailing social and economic order, and asserted that only once private property was abolished, mankind would be living in accordance to God's will. The earth was, after all, to be made a common treasury for all according to the spirit that had been pushing Winstanley to write. It is also important to note that Winstanley's action turn, how I'm going to call it, also differentiated him of most millenarians in the period. He went from a rather passive posture of waiting for the restoration of the spirit within mankind to actually adopting a posture of taking action to help bring about such restoration. The spirit commanded him to act, and act he would in order to restore Eden on earth. The action turn. In the opening pages of the pamphlet, A Watchword to the City of London and the Army, published sometime in August 1649, Winstanley recapped his path from London bankruptcy to the start of the digging. He said, and I quote, "I was made to write a little book called The New Law of Righteousness, and therein I declared it. Yet my mind was not at rest, because nothing was acted, and thoughts ran in me that words and writing were all nothing and must die. For action is the life of all, and if thou dost not act, thou dost nothing. Within a little time, I was made obedient to the word in that particular likewise, for I took my spade and went on and broke the ground upon St. George's Hill in Surrey." But exactly what was at the root of this turn into action? This question is hard to answer objectively, but some hypotheses can be raised. According to Mario Cariccio and Ariel Hessayon, for example, a possible contact with Peter Chamberlain's The Poor Man's Advocate could be one influence for action, more specifically for the occupation of St. George's Hill sometime in April 1649. Even though Chamberlain does not whatsoever advocate for the abolition of property, he does outline proposals of a practical nature to assess the matters concerning the poor and the use of the commons. This could have inspired Winstanley and his fellow diggers to try to come up with their own more practical strategies to access land and disclose God's message of the community of the earth. Something mentioned by both Hessayon and Cariccio to justify this possible link with Chamberlain's, since, as I mentioned, Winstanley does not quote any other authors directly, is a petition dated from 1649 that urged measures very similar to those argued and outlined by Chamberlain to be adopted and disclosed in various parishes. And signatures to such petition should have been collected at Giles Calvert's shop and should be left there for Richard Meadle, the same name of one of the future St. George's Hill diggers. Although doubtless confirmation about these being exactly the same person have not been proven to be 100% accurate so far, it's still a very strong evidence that these could be the same Richard Meadle, the digger and the one that read and advocated for Chamberlain's reforms. Another possibility encompasses contact with the light-shining Buckinghamshire pamphlets, usually associated with more radical levelers in Buckinghamshire, which show affinities of argument with Winstanley, despite not calling for digging action. But in the general context of 1649, it is also worth being considered as a cause for digging seeming necessary. But the general context is also a cause. A context of bad harvests, continuous grievances caused by political instability and war, but at the same time of new possibilities open to a newly kingless England. It was the time to propose new paths for the country to follow. It was a time of rich radical development of ideas, the time to abolish the Norman power once and for all once Charles I was killed. So how were texts used by diggers after this action turn? The apparent shift from writing to acting does not mean, however, that writing was altogether abandoned by Winstanley and the diggers as a component of their strategical scope. Quite the contrary. Nonetheless, it is possible to identify a significant change, a shift in the way that print started to be employed by the group after the start of the digging in April 1649. Instead of long tracts focusing on constructing and disclosing a theory, a theology, from 1649 on, their pamphlets and broadsides seemed to focus primarily on ways of engaging with the public, with the authorities, and most importantly, in establishing disputes of representations and narratives with London newsbooks, general reports about the group and their activities, and dissociation from other radical groups such as the Ranters. In a way, texts seem to have adopted a more practical, immediate character after such action turn. And even the matter of reprinting his earlier tracts in 1649 is also a sign that writing was not at all abandoned. Writing seemed to still matter as much as digging, because the digging had to be justified, defended even, especially after the backlashes from locals, media, and authority. The general response to the diggers tended to be very negative, and they were associated with drunks, with crackbrains, and people who were digging out their own ruins. Therefore, even when trying to dissociate writing from acting, Winstanley and the diggers effectively needed writing to defend themselves, justify the righteousness of their actions, and try to persuade others to support them. This apparent precise division that Winstanley tries to establish is proved actually pretty blurry, if not wholly impracticable, by the materiality of the digger experiment. Then, in 1652, we had the law of freedom in a platform. Oh, sorry, these are two examples of what I call communal writings, of pamphlets that were published during the digging experiment. And we can see from the first pages of these pamphlets, the cover sheets, that they try to establish a dialogue. They're often written as in the form of a petition, a letter, a notice, always trying to engage with the public or the authority somehow. Then in 1652, we had the law of freedom in a platform. Allegedly written in 1649, but published only in 1652, the final pamphlet published by Winstanley was a utopia that outlined in great quantity of detail his views of how the Commonwealth of England should be organized. It had a preface to Oliver Cromwell, where Winstanley acknowledged that he himself did not have the power to bring about change, but Cromwell did, and he was putting his hopes in the Lord Protector. It was a last attempt to influence the government's actions. After the Battle of Worcester, the power of the Parliament was consolidated, and if change was to be brought up, it probably seemed clear at the time that the answer was to do so through Parliament. Winstanley admits that he chose to publish the pamphlet after seeing that Hugh Peters had succeeded in being invited by Parliament to be an advisor after publishing various of his own opinions in print. Again, context influences the way in which writing and action are to be employed. To conclude, Winstanley's famous sentence, "I have writ, I have acted, I have peace," brings about the ideas of print and agency. It seems, therefore, that different moments of the conflicts generated different strategies in printing, and even when action seemed to be prioritized, writing, print, still figure as an important platform to advance action, that is, the digging. Without writing, there would have been no digging. As John Gurney put it, Winstanley's answer to the problems facing the nation involved giving agency to the poor, instead of forcing them to rely on sympathetic reformers to organize them more productively, as opposed, for example, to Hartley and Chamberlain. Living on this note, the surge of digger prints and communities in Buckinghamshire and Wellingborough after the digger experiment in St. George's Hill was already over, reinforces the idea of print as a means, print as action, print as a connection, print as agency. For both in Wellingborough and in Buckinghamshire, digging experiments were set up as well, but also along the publishing of broadsides and pamphlets disclosing why those people were doing so. Mobilizing opinion in early modern England played an important part into the possibility of actually overcoming a group's idea. Thank you.